green heart of a North Carolina summer, an 8-year-old boy named Kian Sterling vanished from a busy national forest campground. He was there one moment, a bright, happy child chasing a butterfly, and gone the next, erased from the landscape as completely as a morning mist. A massive search found nothing, and the official investigation concluded with the most heartbreaking and common of stories. A child had simply wandered too far, become lost in the vast, indifferent wilderness, and succumbed to the elements. For 5 years, that was the accepted truth. A tragic accident that left a family entombed in a state of unending, unresolved grief. Then, 5 years later, 2 university students, conducting research in a remote, untrodden section of the forest, stumbled upon a small, unnatural clearing. There they found the boy's remains. But the discovery was not the end of a sad story. It was the beginning of a dark and bizarre mystery. The scene was not one of a lost child, but of a strange, ritualistic burial. The small skeleton surrounded by a perfect ring of blooming, exotic orchids that had no business growing in a North Carolina forest. This single, shocking discovery would reopen the cold case and launch a new investigation that would follow a trail of microscopic clues, from rare pollen to synthetic fibers, unraveling a story of devastating betrayal and exposing a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, cloaked in the guise of a loving, heartbroken friend. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The air in the Pisgah National Forest in late July was thick and sweet, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint floral perfume of mountain laurel. For 8-year-old Kian Sterling, it was the smell of adventure. He stood at the edge of the campsite, a wooden hiking stick in one hand and a laminated map in the other. His small, serious face, a mask of concentration. "Okay, expedition team," he announced, his voice full of a child's solemn authority. "Base camp is secure. According to my calculations, the primary waterfall objective is 1.5 miles in that direction." His father, Gabriel Sterling, a successful architect with a warm, easy laugh, looked up from the tent he was staking. "Aye, aye, expedition leader, we await your command." Kian's mother, Naomi, a pediatrician whose gentle, calm demeanor was a perfect counterbalance to her husband's boisterous energy, smiled from the camp chair where she was organizing their food supplies. "Just make sure your calculations include a mandatory stop for s'mores, Mr. Leader," she said. The scene was a portrait of idyllic family life, a perfect, sun-dappled moment of peace and connection. The 4th member of their expedition, Donovan Hail, emerged from his own tent, stretching his arms. He was Gabriel's best friend since college and his partner at their thriving architectural firm. To Kian, he was simply Uncle Don, a figure of immense fun and adventure, the one who would always say yes to another ghost story around the campfire. "Is the leader accepting any new recruits?" Donovan asked, ruffling Kian's hair. "I've got some high-level intel on a rare species of butterfly seen near the creek." Kian's eyes lit up. His passions were maps and insects, in that order. "A rare one? What kind?" "Eastern tiger swallowtail," Donovan said with a conspiratorial wink. Very elusive. That was the moment. The small, seemingly insignificant pivot upon which their entire world would turn. "Can I go look, Dad?" "Just to the creek." "I can see it from here." Gabriel glanced over. The creek was a silver ribbon, glittering through the trees, no more than 50 yards from their campsite. The campground was busy, filled with other families. It felt safe, a small pocket of civilization carved into the vast wilderness. "Okay, buddy," he said, "but you do not go out of sight. You hear me? Stay where we can see you." "Yes, sir," Kian said. Giving a sharp salute, he turned, his map tucked under his arm, and with the focused, determined gait of a seasoned explorer, he headed towards the creek, his bright yellow t-shirt, a small, happy sun, moving through the deep green shadows of the forest. The next few minutes passed in the easy, comfortable rhythm of setting up camp. Gabriel finished with the tent, Naomi organized the cooler. Donovan started gathering kindling for a fire. It was Gabriel who looked up first. A sudden, quiet unease prickling at the back of his neck. The patch of yellow was gone. "Kian," he called out, his voice casual at first. "You still see that butterfly?" There was no answer, only the gentle murmur of the creek and the distant chatter of other campers. "Kian," he called again, louder this time, a sharp edge of parental anxiety in his voice. Silence. The panic was a sudden, cold wave. He and Naomi exchanged a look of pure, primal terror. In an instant, they were on their feet, running towards the creek, Donovan close behind them. "Kian!" Naomi screamed, her voice a raw, ragged sound that was utterly alien to the peaceful forest. They reached the creek in seconds. It was a shallow, gentle stream, burbling over smooth, mossy rocks. There was no sign of him. No footprints in the soft mud of the bank. No sign of a fall. It was as if he had simply been erased. The next hour was a blur of frantic, disorganized terror. They crashed through the undergrowth, their calls growing hoarser, more desperate. They searched up and down the small creek, their minds a frantic slideshow of every parent's worst nightmare. A slip, a fall, a snake, a stranger. Donovan was a rock of calm in their chaos, directing them, trying to organize a logical search pattern, his voice a steady, reassuring presence in their rising tide of panic. But the forest was a vast, indifferent maze. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow held a new terror. Finally, his face grim, Donovan made the call. "We have to call the rangers, Gabe," he said, his hand on his friend's shoulder. "We need help. We need a real search." The arrival of the park rangers and the sheriff's deputies transformed their personal nightmare into an official incident. The quiet, idyllic campsite became the chaotic, floodlit nerve center of a missing child search. As Gabriel and Naomi sat huddled in a camp chair, wrapped in blankets they didn't feel, their world had shrunk to a single, unbearable, and endlessly repeating question. Where was their son? The official search for Kian Sterling began with a practiced, if grim, efficiency. The POV shifts to the lead detective from the local county sheriff's office, a man named Ben Carter. Carter was a 20-year veteran, a competent, by-the-book cop who had seen his share of tragedies in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Pisgah National Forest. A missing child case was the worst kind of call, a race against a clock that was already ticking with terrifying speed. The incident command post, established in the campground's main parking lot, was a hive of activity by nightfall. The air hummed with the crackle of radios and the low murmur of dozens of searchers being briefed. The operation was a multi-agency effort. A small army of park rangers, sheriff's deputies, and volunteer search and rescue teams from 3 surrounding counties. Detective Carter's first and most critical task was to interview the parents and the other witness. He found Gabriel and Naomi Sterling sitting in the back of an ambulance, their faces pale and drawn with shock, their eyes wide with a terror that Carter knew all too well. He spoke to them gently, his questions precise, trying to build a timeline, a picture of the last moments before the boy had vanished. Their story was a chaotic, grief-stricken narrative of a happy afternoon that had shattered in an instant. His interview with the family friend, Donovan Hail, was a different matter. Hail was a rock. While clearly devastated, his grief was controlled, his mind sharp and analytical. He provided Carter with a clear, concise, and logical account of the events. He described Kian's excitement, the butterfly, the exact spot where he had last seen the boy. He was the perfect witness, calm, cooperative, and articulate. His statement became the foundational document of the entire investigation, the firm ground upon which the search was built. He was a good kid, Hale told Carter, his voice thick with a controlled emotion, smart, cautious. He wouldn't have just wandered off. He loved his maps. He always followed the rules. That's what's so damn strange about this. The search itself was a massive brute force assault on the wilderness. At first light, teams of ground pounders fanned out from the campsite, moving in long, methodical lines, their eyes scanning every inch of the forest floor. Canine units were brought in, their handlers giving the dogs a scent article from one of Kian's shirts. But the terrain was the enemy. The forest was a dense, vertical world of steep ravines and impenetrable rhododendron thickets. The ground was a thick, damp carpet of leaves that held no tracks. The dogs followed a faint scent trail from the campsite to the creek, and then, for a few hundred yards along the bank, before the trail simply evaporated, the swirling air currents and the overwhelming scent of the water and decaying vegetation confusing the animals. It was a dead end. A helicopter chopped at the air overhead, but the dense, triple canopy forest rendered the aerial search almost useless. The crew could see nothing but a vast, undulating sea of green. Donovan Hail became a central and universally admired figure in the search. He refused to sit on the sidelines with the grieving parents. He insisted on joining one of the volunteer teams, his architect's mind proving invaluable as he helped the search managers to read the topographical maps and organize more efficient search grids. He was a pillar of strength, a man who seemed to be channeling his own grief into a desperate, heroic effort to find the child he clearly loved like his own. The other volunteers and the law enforcement officers on the scene were deeply impressed by his fortitude, his intelligence, and his unwavering dedication. But day after day, the search yielded nothing. The forest remained stubbornly, maddeningly silent. The teams found old beer cans, a lost hiking pole, the skeletal remains of a deer, but not a single, microscopic trace of Kian Sterling. No scrap of his yellow t-shirt, no dropped map, no cry for help. It was a perfect vacuum of evidence. As the days turned into a week, the mood at the command post shifted from one of frantic hope to one of grim, dogged resignation. The statistical probability of finding an 8-year-old child alive in the wilderness after this much time was plummeting towards zero. The search was becoming less a rescue mission and more a recovery operation. Detective Carter, a pragmatist, knew they were now looking for a body. But the forest, which had so easily swallowed a small boy, was refusing to give him back. After 7 days of the most intensive search in the county's recent history, the operation was officially scaled down. The decision was a logistical and emotional necessity, a tacit admission of defeat in the face of the vast, silent wilderness. The volunteers were sent home, their faces etched with exhaustion and a shared sense of failure. The command post was dismantled, leaving behind only the trampled grass and the ghosts of a hope that had slowly, inexorably died. Detective Carter had the grim and all too familiar task of sitting down with Gabriel and Naomi Sterling to deliver the news. He met them in the quiet, sterile environment of a borrowed office at the ranger station, a place that felt a million miles away from the raw, chaotic emotion of the past week. "We've done everything we can," Carter began, his voice a low, weary monotone. "We have covered over 20 square miles of some of the toughest terrain in this state. We have used every resource at our disposal. And we have found no sign of Kian. We have found no evidence of an abduction. We have found no evidence of any foul play." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the small room. "At this point, we are forced to conclude the most probable and most tragic of scenarios. We believe that Kian, in his excitement, followed the creek further than he intended, became disoriented, and got lost. In a wilderness this vast, a small child can become hopelessly lost in a matter of minutes. We believe he succumbed to the elements, likely from exposure and dehydration, within the first 48 hours. The lost child theory was the official conclusion. It was a narrative of tragic, random misadventure. It was a story without a villain, without a crime, without any malice. The antagonist was the wilderness itself, an ancient, indifferent force that had simply reclaimed one of its own. It was a story that was both horrifying and, in a strange way, clean. It required no further investigation, no unanswered questions. Gabriel Sterling, his face a hollow mask of grief, simply nodded, too broken to argue. But Naomi, her pediatrician's mind a torture chamber of clinical details, began to question. But the dogs, they lost his scent at the creek. There were no tracks. He was a rule follower. He had his map. He wouldn't have just. Her voice trailed off, the protest dying in her throat, a small, futile argument against the crushing weight of official certainty. Donovan Hail, who had insisted on being at the meeting, stepped in, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Honey." He was 8 years old. He saw a butterfly. He got excited. It could have happened to any kid. It's nobody's fault. It's just a terrible, terrible accident. His words, meant to be a comfort, were in fact the final nail in the coffin of any other possibility. He was validating the official theory, his testimony as the last person to see Kian alive now, the cornerstone of the entire conclusion. The case of Kian Sterling was officially declared inactive, pending the discovery of new evidence. It would become a local statistic, a ghost story told by parents to their children to keep them close on camping trips. It was a tragedy that was now, for all official purposes, explained. For Detective Carter, it was another sad, frustrating file to be placed in the cold case drawer, a reminder of the limits of his own profession. For Gabriel and Naomi Sterling, it was the beginning of a life sentence of unimaginable grief. A grief made infinitely heavier by the lack of a body, of a final resting place, of the simple, human need for closure. They were left with only a theory. A story of a boy who had been swallowed by the forest. The forest, having provided the perfect, silent stage for the tragedy, now fell quiet, its secrets locked away in the deep, green, and impenetrable heart of the mountains. 5 years is a chasm. For Gabriel and Naomi Sterling, the 5 years since Kian had vanished were a slow, grinding erosion of the life they had once known. The sharp, screaming agony of the initial loss had settled into a vast, silent landscape of permanent grief, a place where they now lived as two lonely, isolated inhabitants. Their beautiful, architect-designed home in Charlotte, once a vibrant hub of laughter, art, and the happy chaos of a child's life, had become a quiet, perfectly preserved museum. Kian's room remained untouched, his Lego creations still on the shelves, his collection of maps still pinned to a corkboard on the wall. It was a shrine that was both a comfort and a source of constant, exquisite pain. The POV is with Naomi. As a pediatrician, her grief was a unique form of torture. Her days were spent in the world of children, of fevers, of scraped knees, of the bright, resilient life force of her young patients. She was a healer, a protector, but she had been unable to protect her own son. Her professional mind would, in the quiet, sleepless hours of the night, torment her with the clinical details of his probable end. She would calculate the rate of dehydration in a child of his size, the stages of hypothermia, the terror he must have felt. Her medical knowledge, once a source of pride and purpose, had become a weapon she turned upon herself. Her marriage to Gabriel, once a partnership of deep, symbiotic love, had become a fragile, brittle thing. They were two people trapped on the same, sinking island of grief, but they were unable to reach each other. Gabriel had thrown himself into his work with a frantic, obsessive energy, designing buildings that were stark, minimalist, and devoid of the warmth that had once been his signature. He rarely spoke of Kian. His grief was a locked room, and he had thrown away the key. Naomi's grief was the opposite. It was a constant, palpable presence, a third person in their marriage. They were held together now only by the fragile, shared thread of their son's memory. The one constant, the one unwavering pillar of support in their fractured world was Donovan Hail. He had remained fiercely, almost ferociously loyal. He was the one who had managed the difficult, painful process of winding down Gabriel's side of the architectural firm, shielding his grieving friend from the brutal logistics of a failed business. He was the one who showed up at their house every Friday night for dinner, a ritual that had become the one predictable anchor in their week. He was the keeper of Kian's memory. He would tell stories of the boy, of his bright, inquisitive mind, of his funny, old-soul pronouncements. He would bring them photos he had found, small, forgotten moments of a life that was now gone. To Gabriel and Naomi, he was more than a friend. He was a lifeline. The one person in the world who seemed to understand the depth of their loss. The one person who had been there on that last, terrible day. He was the co-owner of their grief. But even in her gratitude, Naomi, with her doctor's trained eye for subtle symptoms, had sometimes felt a strange, dissonant note in Donovan's presence. His grief, while seemingly profound, was also performative. His stories of Kian, while comforting, were always the same, repeated with the same emotional beats, like a well-rehearsed script. And his focus on their well-being, while touching, sometimes felt less like concern and more like a kind of intense, watchful surveillance. She had dismissed these feelings as the paranoid projections of her own grief-addled mind. Donovan was their savior. He was the only thing holding their broken lives together. To doubt him would be to lose the last, stable piece of their world. So she had pushed the feelings down into the deep, quiet place where all the other unbearable thoughts resided. As the 5th anniversary of Kian's disappearance approached, a profound weariness had settled over Naomi. The hope that had flickered in the first few years, the desperate, irrational belief that he might one day be found alive, had finally been extinguished. All that was left was the quiet, unending ache of his absence. The lost child theory, which she had never fully believed, had, through the sheer grinding weight of time, become the only story she had. She had accepted that she would live the rest of her life in this state of suspended animation, forever the mother of a boy who had been swallowed by a forest. His final story, a mystery that would never be solved. The world of forensic botany is a quiet, patient, and largely invisible one. It is a science of whispers and traces, of finding the stories that plants tell about the places they grow and the events they have witnessed. In the late summer, 5 years after Kian Sterling had vanished, 2 graduate students from Duke University's botany department were engaged in this quiet science, deep in a remote, little-used section of the Pisgah National Forest. Their names were Maya and Ben, and their specific esoteric mission was to conduct a field survey for a rare and possibly undiscovered species of maidenhair fern. Their work required them to leave the trails, to bushwhack their way into the damp, shaded, and inaccessible ravines where such delicate plants might be found. They moved with the practiced, confident ease of young scientists who were more at home in the wilderness than in a lecture hall. They had been hiking for several hours, following the faint, animal track-like path of a small, seasonal creek up a steep, mossy embankment. The air was cool and still, the only sound the gurgle of the water and the distant territorial call of a pileated woodpecker. It was Maya who saw it first. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against the trunk of a large hemlock, and her eyes were drawn to a small clearing just ahead, on a flat shelf of land that jutted out from the mountainside. There was something wrong with the clearing. It was too perfect. In the chaotic, organic tangle of the old-growth forest, with its fallen logs and dense undergrowth, this clearing was a perfect, almost geometric circle, and the ground inside it was different. It was a patch of dark, rich soil, almost black, a stark contrast to the reddish-brown clay of the surrounding forest floor. "Ben, come look at this," she called out, her voice a low, curious whisper. Ben joined her, and they stared at the clearing. It felt unnatural, man-made. It was as if someone had come to this remote, inaccessible place and had deliberately, meticulously carved a perfect circle out of the wilderness. A powerful, primal curiosity, the same impulse that drives all scientific inquiry, took hold. They approached the clearing cautiously, their boots silent on the soft, damp earth. As they got closer, they saw that the circle was delineated by a ring of smooth, gray river stones, each one placed with a kind of careful, deliberate precision. The stones were out of place. The geology of this ridge was shale and granite, not river rock. Someone had carried these stones here, and then they saw what was inside the circle. At first, it was just a jumble of pale white shapes, almost the color of bleached twigs scattered on the dark soil. But as their eyes adjusted, as their minds processed the impossible information, the shapes resolved themselves. They were bones, small, delicate bones, a rib cage no bigger than a bird cage, a slender femur, and at the top of the pile, a small, perfect human skull. A profound, shocked silence fell between them. The air in the clearing seemed to grow cold. The peaceful forest, suddenly a place of immense, terrifying menace. They were standing in a grave, a child's grave. They backed away slowly, their hearts pounding, their scientific detachment shattered by the raw, visceral horror of their discovery. This was not an archaeological find. This was a crime scene, a bizarre, ritualistic crime scene. They didn't speak until they were 100 yards away, back in the familiar, chaotic safety of the deep woods. Ben, his hands shaking, pulled out his satellite phone, a device he carried for emergencies, and dialed 911. The call, routed through a series of relays, eventually reached the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. Ben's voice was a strained, shaky whisper as he tried to explain what they had found. His words a jumble of bones, a circle of stones, and a child. They waited at the trailhead for what felt like an eternity. The image of the small white bones burned into their minds. They had gone into the forest, searching for a rare fern, a symbol of life. They had come out having found a secret place of death, a strange, silent shrine in the heart of the wilderness. The discovery of a child's skeletal remains in the high backcountry of the Pisgah National Forest triggered an immediate, high-priority response. The case was instantly taken over by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, SBI. The lead agent assigned to the case was Detective Zoe Shaw. Shaw was a rising star in the SBI's cold case unit, a sharp, modern investigator with a master's degree in forensic science and a reputation for seeing the hidden, often microscopic, patterns that others had missed. She arrived at the remote, makeshift command post by helicopter, the downdraft from the rotors flattening the tall grass in the mountain meadow. The scene was already a hive of controlled, professional activity. The local sheriff's department had secured the area, and a team from the state medical examiner's office was on standby. Detective Shaw's first act was to make the arduous, 2-hour hike to the crime scene itself, accompanied by the 2 shaken but composed botany students who had made the discovery. When she finally stepped into the small, circular clearing, the scene that greeted her was even more bizarre and unsettling than the initial report had suggested. She had seen dozens of clandestine graves in her career, but she had never seen anything like this. The small skeleton, which would later be identified as that of Kian Sterling, lay within the perfect circle of river stones. But it was not a simple pile of bones. It had been deliberately, almost artistically, arranged. The skull was placed in the center, facing upwards. The long bones of the arms and legs were laid out in a symmetrical, sunburst pattern, radiating outwards from the skull. The small bones of the hands and feet were arranged in neat, separate piles. It was a scene of profound, obsessive, and deeply disturbing order. It was not the work of an animal, nor the natural result of decay. It was the work of a human hand, a hand that was not just hiding a body, but was creating a kind of macabre sculpture. But it was the other element of the scene that was the most shocking, the detail that would come to define the entire baffling case. Planted in the dark, rich soil, in a perfect secondary ring just inside the circle of stones, were a dozen blooming, exotic flowers. They were orchids, their large, intricate, and almost alien-looking blossoms. A splash of vibrant, impossible color in the muted greens and browns of the forest. They were a species of flower that had no business being on a remote North Carolina mountainside. And they were not just surviving, they were thriving. Their roots clearly established in the soil, their blossoms perfectly, impossibly cultivated. Detective Shaw, a city person with only a passing knowledge of botany, knew enough to recognize that this was a profound and fundamental clue. She knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, and looked closer at the flowers. They were unlike anything she had ever seen, their petals a complex architecture of stripes and pouches, their color a deep royal purple. "This is impossible," one of the botany students whispered from behind the crime scene tape, his voice a mixture of awe and horror. "Those are orchids. And not just any orchids. They look like paphiopedilums, slipper orchids. They don't grow here. They don't grow anywhere in North America. They're native to Southeast Asia. Shaw looked from the impossible flowers to the small, arranged skeleton they surrounded. The entire scene felt like something from a dark fairy tale, a place of strange, ritualistic magic. But Shaw was a detective, not a folklorist. She did not believe in magic. She believed in evidence. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was looking at a crime scene that was also a message. The killer had not just buried a child. They had created a shrine. And the key to understanding the killer, she realized, was to first understand the flowers. The investigation had to begin not with a search for a human monster, but with the identification of a rare, exotic, and impossible orchid. The crime scene in the high-altitude clearing was processed with a level of meticulous, almost reverent care that is reserved for the most bizarre and sensitive of cases. Every bone fragment, every stone, every leaf was photographed, its position logged by GPS and then carefully collected. But the most critical pieces of evidence, Detective Zoe Shaw knew, were the orchids. A forensic botanist from the state crime lab was flown to the scene. Her sole task was to document, identify, and carefully excavate the impossible flowers and the soil they were planted in. She worked with the delicate precision of a surgeon, her face a mask of intense, professional concentration. Her preliminary on-site identification confirmed what the botany student had suspected. The orchids were a species of paphiopedilum, or slipper orchid. But it was her formal report, delivered to Detective Shaw a week later, that provided the first major case-altering pivot of the investigation. The report was a stunning document. The botanist had positively identified the species as Paphiopedilum rothschildianum, more commonly and evocatively known as the gold of Kinabalu. It was one of the rarest, most sought-after, and most valuable orchids in the world, a legendary, almost mythical, species native only to a single mountain in Borneo. "This is not a flower you can buy at a local nursery, detective," the botanist explained to Shaw over the phone, her voice a mixture of scientific excitement and professional gravity. "A mature, blooming-size Paphiopedilum rothschildianum can be worth thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. It is the holy grail for a certain type of collector." But the most critical part of her report was not the value of the orchid, but the difficulty of its cultivation. "This is not a plant that just grows," the botanist continued. "It is notoriously, legendarily difficult to keep alive, let alone bring to bloom. It requires a perfectly controlled environment, a specialized greenhouse with precise temperature, humidity, and light controls. The plants we found at your scene were not just planted there. They were mature, healthy, and perfectly cultivated specimens that were then transplanted. The person who grew these is not a casual hobbyist. They are a master horticulturalist, an expert of the highest caliber." The forensic report was a bombshell. It completely reshaped the profile of the killer. Shaw was no longer looking for a random drifter or a local predator. She was looking for a highly specialized, intelligent, and likely wealthy individual. Someone with the knowledge, the resources, and the obsession to cultivate one of the world's rarest flowers. The crime, which had at first seemed like a chaotic, ritualistic act, now looked different. It was still bizarre, but it was not chaotic. It was precise, deliberate, and deeply, obsessively personal. The orchids were not a random decoration. They were a signature. The killer had surrounded his victim with his most prized, valuable, and beautiful possessions. The investigation now had a clear, if bizarre, direction. Shaw and her team began a new, highly specialized search. They were not looking for a man with a criminal record. They were looking for a man with a greenhouse. They began the painstaking process of building a list of every known high-end orchid collector in the state of North Carolina. They scoured the membership lists of elite horticultural societies. They monitored the online forums and black market auction sites where rare orchids were traded like jewels. The profile of the killer was now that of a man living a double life. A man who was, on the surface, likely a respected, successful individual, but who harbored a secret, all-consuming passion, a passion that had, for some unknown reason, become entangled with the murder of an 8-year-old boy. The search for Kian Sterling's killer had become a hunt for the owner of a secret, impossible garden. With a crime scene as bizarre and ritualistic as the one they had found, the investigation naturally and logically veered down its first and most obvious path, the occult. A child's skeleton, deliberately arranged in a circle of stones and surrounded by strange, exotic flowers, had all the hallmarks of a dark, ritualistic killing. The theory was grim, but it was a plausible and necessary line of inquiry. Detective Zoe Shaw, though her own instincts were already focused on the botanical evidence, knew that she had to thoroughly investigate and eliminate this possibility. She assigned 2 of her best detectives to a deep dive into the strange, often hidden subcultures of the rural Appalachian communities that bordered the Pisgah National Forest. The task was a frustrating and often surreal journey into a world of local folklore, fringe religious groups, and backwoods paranoia. The detectives started by cross-referencing the location of the crime scene with any known sites of local legend or supposed supernatural activity. They interviewed local historians, folklorists, and even a self-proclaimed white witch who lived in a cabin on the edge of the forest. They heard stories of old, pre-Christian folk magic, of strange symbols found carved into trees, of rumors of cult-like communes that had existed in the mountains decades ago. The investigation was a slow, painstaking process of chasing whispers and rumors. They looked into every missing person case from the surrounding counties, searching for any patterns of ritualistic activity. They compiled a list of known individuals with a history of animal cruelty or an interest in the occult. The list was long, and the leads were all thin. The theory gained some traction when a retired sheriff's deputy recalled a case from the late 1990s involving a small, doomsday cult that had been operating out of a remote compound not far from where Kian's body was found. The cult had disbanded after its leader was arrested on unrelated charges, but the memory of their strange, secretive rituals lingered in the community's consciousness. Shaw's team spent a week tracking down and interviewing former members of the cult. They were a sad collection of lost souls, their lives now a mundane landscape of jobs and families. The fire of their former fanaticism long since extinguished. They knew nothing. The occult theory, while compelling on the surface, began to fall apart under the weight of its own lack of evidence. There were no other similar crimes, no pattern of ritualistic activity in the region. The scene in the woods was a singular, isolated event. And the central nagging piece of evidence that didn't fit the occult narrative was the orchids. A backwoods cult, or a lone, disturbed individual, would be unlikely to have access to, or the horticultural expertise to cultivate, one of the world's rarest and most expensive flowers. The orchids felt too sophisticated, too specific, too elegant for the crude, violent world of a ritualistic killer. After several weeks of intensive investigation, Shaw made the call to pivot the investigation away from the occult theory. It was a red herring, a logical but ultimately false path that had consumed precious time and resources. She was now more certain than ever that the key to the case was not in the symbolism of the stone circle, but in the science of the flowers themselves. The killer was not a wild-eyed fanatic. They were a cool, calculating, and obsessive collector. The crime was not an act of dark magic. It was an act of a very specific and very human pathology. The red herring had been a necessary detour, but now it was time to get back on the main road, a road that she was sure led directly to a secret, climate-controlled greenhouse. With the occult theory now relegated to the category of a dead end, Detective Zoe Shaw knew it was time to return to the human center of the case. She had a profile of the killer, a master orchid grower. But she had no motive, no connection between this strange, secret world and the Sterling family. She decided to re-interview the 3 people who had been there on that last terrible day: Gabriel and Naomi Sterling. and the family's best friend, Donovan Hail. She was not just looking for new information. She was looking for a hidden link, a forgotten detail that might connect their world to the strange, exotic world of the killer. Her meeting with Gabriel and Naomi was a difficult, heartbreaking affair. The discovery of their son's body had not brought them closure, but a new, more terrible kind of pain. The vague, formless grief of a missing child had been replaced by the sharp, violent certainty of a murder. They sat in the living room of their quiet, museum-like home, their faces a portrait of exhausted, hollowed-out sorrow. Shaw walked them through the details of the crime scene, her voice gentle but her questions precise. She asked about the orchids, showing them a photograph of the rare, beautiful flowers. "Have you ever seen a flower like this before?" she asked. "Did Kian have a particular interest in them? Do you know anyone? A friend, a neighbor, a colleague, who grows orchids?" They stared at the photograph, their expressions blank. "No," Naomi whispered, shaking her head. "I've never seen anything like that. Kian, he loved bugs and maps, not flowers." Gabriel, lost in his own silent world of grief, simply shook his head. The interview was another dead end. There was no apparent connection between the Sterling family and the world of elite horticulture. Her interview with Donovan Hail took place a few days later, at his own impeccably designed architectural office. He was, as he had been in the original investigation, the picture of a devastated, heartbroken friend. He greeted Shaw with a firm handshake and a look of grim, somber resolve. "Detective, anything I can do to help find the sick monster who did this to that little boy, you just ask," he said, his voice thick with a raw, convincing emotion. Shaw began by walking him through the same questions she had asked the Sterlings. She showed him the photograph of the orchids. He stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "My God," he said softly. "They're beautiful, but no, I've never seen anything like that in my life. And to put them there, it's just sick. It's some kind of twisted, evil signature." He was a perfect witness. He was empathetic, cooperative, and his reactions were entirely, convincingly normal. He spoke of Kian with a deep, aching affection. He spoke of his friends, Gabriel and Naomi, with a profound, protective concern. He was, to all outward appearances, a good man trapped in an unimaginable nightmare. But Shaw, a detective trained to see the subtle tells, the microscopic cracks in a performance, noticed something. As she was packing up her files, preparing to leave, she asked one final, seemingly innocuous question. "The soil at the scene was unusual," she said, her tone casual, as if she were just thinking out loud. "The lab says it wasn't native to the forest. It was some kind of special potting mix." She was watching his eyes. And for a single, fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, she saw it. A flicker, a momentary tightening of the muscles around his eyes, a brief, involuntary loss of the relaxed, cooperative mask he had been wearing. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same look of concerned concentration, but she had seen it. It was the look of a man who had just been confronted with a detail he had not expected, a piece of the crime scene he had not controlled. "Huh," he said, his voice a perfect imitation of mild curiosity. "That's strange. I guess this guy, whoever he is, he really knew what he was doing." Shaw left the interview with a new, deeply unsettling feeling. Donovan Hale's performance had been flawless, but that single, momentary flicker had been a tell. It was a crack in the facade. It was not evidence. It was not even a suspicion. It was just a question, a new, dark possibility that began to form in her mind. The killer wasn't a stranger. The killer had been in the room with her. Detective Zoe Shaw's fleeting observation of Donovan Hale's reaction was a ghost, an intangible piece of intuition that she could not bring to a prosecutor. She needed a bridge, a piece of hard physical evidence that could connect the strange, ritualistic crime scene in the woods to the clean, orderly world of the victims. The orchids were a signature, but they were a dead end without a direct link. Following a hunch, a detective's instinct that the killer's obsession with perfection would be his undoing, she decided to take a closer look at the one thing everyone had overlooked: the dirt. She sent a formal request to the SBI crime lab for a comprehensive materials analysis of the soil that had been collected from the orchid planting. The initial botanical report had identified it as a non-native potting mix. Shaw wanted to know more. She wanted a complete chemical and physical breakdown. She was looking for a needle in a haystack, a microscopic clue that might have been transported with the soil from the killer's primary location. The task fell to a forensic geologist in the lab, a man who specialized in soil and mineral analysis. The work was tedious and highly technical. He used a series of advanced techniques: X-ray diffraction to identify the mineral content, gas chromatography to detect organic compounds, and finally, scanning electron microscopy for a visual analysis of the soil's microscopic components. For a week, the results were unremarkable. The soil was, as the botanist had reported, a high-end, commercial-grade orchid potting mix. It contained a specific and expensive blend of perlite, charcoal, fir bark, and a premium, slow-release orchid fertilizer. It was the kind of mix a serious, dedicated horticulturalist would use. This confirmed the profile of the killer, but it didn't provide a direct link. The bombshell came on the 8th day of the analysis. The geologist was conducting the final sweep, using the scanning electron microscope to look for any foreign particulates, and he found them. Mixed in with the organic soil particles were several tiny, synthetic fibers. They were a brilliant, almost electric blue, a color that was utterly alien to the natural components of the soil. They were microscopic, no bigger than a pollen grain, and would have been completely invisible to the naked eye. The geologist isolated the fibers and subjected them to a final analysis using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, a technique that could identify the precise chemical composition of a material. The result came back, and it was the second and most critical forensic pivot of the investigation. The fibers were identified as a specific proprietary type of extruded polystyrene, a material used in high-end, rigid foam insulation. A cross-reference with a commercial manufacturing database narrowed it down even further. The specific dye and chemical composition of the blue fibers were a perfect match for a single product, a brand of commercial-grade greenhouse insulation prized by high-end builders for its superior thermal properties. The report landed on Detective Shaw's desk, and it was the key that unlocked the entire case. The killer hadn't just brought the orchids and the soil to the crime scene. He had unknowingly brought a piece of his own secret world with him. The microscopic blue fibers were a direct physical link between the grave in the forest and a specific, high-end, custom-built greenhouse. Shaw's investigation now had a tangible, physical target. She was no longer looking for a man who grew orchids. She was looking for a man who had recently built or renovated a greenhouse using this specific, premium brand of blue insulation. The occult theories, the vague profiles of eccentric collectors, all of it was swept away by this single, microscopic piece of evidence. She now had a way to connect the bizarre, ritualistic crime scene to a specific, physical location. The ghost in the machine of the investigation was no longer a ghost. It had a color, and the color was blue. The discovery of the blue insulation fibers was the fulcrum upon which the entire investigation now turned. It was a piece of evidence that was both microscopic and monumental, a tiny thread that Detective Zoe Shaw was convinced would lead her directly to the killer. The hunt for a suspect was no longer a vague search for a personality type. It was a specific, targeted search for a building. The investigation became a painstaking exercise in cross-referencing public records and commercial data. Shaw and her team began by compiling a list of every building permit issued for the construction or renovation of a greenhouse in the entire western North Carolina region for the 2 years prior to Kian Sterling's disappearance. The initial list was dauntingly long, with over 100 entries. Next, they cross-referenced this list with the customer databases of the handful of high-end, specialty contractors in the region who dealt with the specific brand of blue insulation identified by the lab. This narrowed the field considerably. The premium insulation was expensive, used only in top-of-the-line, custom-built projects. The list shrank from over 100 to just 12. The final step was to cross-reference these 12 names with the membership lists of elite horticultural societies, with the subscriber lists of orchid collector journals, and with the online forums where rare plants were discussed and traded. Shaw was looking for an intersection, a single name that appeared in all three datasets. A person who had built a greenhouse with the right insulation and who was also a known, serious orchid enthusiast. As the analyst began to run the final cross-reference, a tense, expectant silence fell over the cold case unit. They were on the verge of a major breakthrough, the culmination of weeks of tedious, methodical work. The analyst typed in the final command, and the computer began to churn through the data. After a moment, a single name appeared on the screen. Detective Shaw stared at the name, a cold, sickening feeling of vindication washing over her. The name on the screen was Donovan Hail. The pieces of the puzzle now clicked into place with a horrifying, inexorable logic. Donovan Hail, the grieving best friend, the beloved Uncle Don, was a secret, nationally recognized, award-winning orchid collector. It was a passion, a secret life, that he had kept completely separate from his world with the Sterlings. The building permit for his property showed that he had completed construction on a state-of-the-art, custom-built greenhouse just 6 months before Kian had vanished. The contractor who had built it confirmed that they had used the specific, high-end blue insulation at Mr. Hale's personal insistence. The entire, bizarre, and seemingly random crime was now anchored to a single person. The man who had been the primary witness was now the primary, and only, suspect. Shaw now had more than enough evidence to get a search warrant for Donovan Hale's property. The warrant was sealed, the operation planned with the secrecy and precision of a military raid. The goal was not just to find evidence, but to prevent Hale from destroying it. The search was executed at dawn. While one team of SBI agents detained a shocked and protesting Donovan Hail at his office, another team, led by Shaw herself, entered his suburban home. The house was a testament to a refined, minimalist taste. There, hidden behind a tall wooden fence, was the greenhouse. It was a magnificent structure of glass and steel, a modern temple dedicated to the cultivation of beauty. When Shaw stepped inside, she was met with a blast of warm, humid air and an almost overwhelming floral scent. The interior was a breathtaking, tropical wonderland, filled with hundreds of orchids of every shape, size, and color. And in a special, climate-controlled section at the back, under a soft purple grow light, was a collection of the rarest and most beautiful of all, a dozen perfect, blooming specimens of the gold of Kinabalu, Paphiopedilum rothschildianum. But it was a small, mundane detail that was the final, damning piece of evidence. In a potting shed attached to the greenhouse, they found several open bags of a custom orchid potting mix. And on the floor, scattered around the potting bench, were hundreds of tiny, almost invisible synthetic blue fibers, shed from the insulation during the greenhouse's construction. The fibers were a perfect match to the ones found at the grave. The secret garden had given up its killer. The search of Donovan Hale's property was a slow, methodical deconstruction of a secret life. While the greenhouse had provided the stunning, visual confirmation of his obsession and the direct forensic link to the crime scene, Detective Zoe Shaw knew that the motive, the why, would not be found among the flowers. It would be found in the cold, hard numbers of his other life, the one he shared with Gabriel Sterling. Armed with a second, more comprehensive warrant, Shaw's team began a deep dive into the finances of both Donovan Hail and the Sterling Hail architectural firm. They subpoenaed bank records, investment portfolios, and, most critically, the details of every insurance policy held by the partners. The truth, when it was finally unearthed by a forensic accountant, was a story of staggering greed and a long, slow, and secret betrayal. The architectural firm, which had appeared so successful on the surface, was a house of cards. Donovan, who handled the firm's finances, had been systematically embezzling money for years, funneling it into a series of disastrous, high-risk real estate investments. The company was on the verge of a catastrophic and very public bankruptcy, a fact he had successfully hidden from his trusting, design-focused partner, Gabriel. But the most damning discovery was the insurance policy. 2 years before Kian's disappearance, Donovan had convinced Gabriel to sign a massive, multi-million-dollar Keyman life insurance policy. The policy was designed to protect the business in the event of the death of a critical partner. The beneficiary of the policy was not Gabriel's family, but the firm itself, of which Donovan would become the sole owner in the event of Gabriel's death. The motive was now brutally, chillingly clear. The camping trip to the Pisgah National Forest was not an innocent family vacation. It was the chosen location for a murder. Donovan Hail's plan was to kill his best friend, Gabriel Sterling, and make it look like a tragic hiking accident. The insurance payout would solve all of his financial problems, making him a rich man and saving him from the disgrace of bankruptcy. He would be the grieving friend, the sole survivor of a terrible tragedy, who would heroically keep the firm alive in his partner's memory. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle was Kian. The 8-year-old boy had not been the target. He had been a witness. Shaw, using her knowledge of the terrain and the details of the campsite, was able to reconstruct the most probable scenario. Donovan had likely lured Gabriel away from the main campsite under the pretense of scouting a hiking trail. His plan was to push him from a cliff or stage, a fatal fall. But Kian, the bright, inquisitive, map-loving boy, had followed them. Or had simply, by a tragic accident of timing, wandered in the same direction. He had come upon the scene at the worst possible moment. He had seen his beloved Uncle Don doing something that was not right, perhaps tampering with Gabriel's climbing gear, or preparing for the final, violent act. Kian, the accidental witness, had become a liability that Donovan, in his cold, panicked calculus, could not afford. The murder of the child was not part of the plan. It was a desperate, brutal improvisation to silence the only person who could expose him. The final, bizarre act of the orchids was now also horribly clear. It was not the act of a cultist or a madman. It was a twisted, narcissistic act of remorse from a man who saw himself as a connoisseur of rare and beautiful things. He had just extinguished a rare and beautiful life. In his own psychopathic way, by surrounding the boy with his most prized, beautiful, and rare possessions, he was giving him a tribute. It was a killer's apology, a gesture that was both a confession of guilt and a testament to his own monstrous ego. The complete, horrifying narrative was now in place. It was a story that had begun with a simple, common motive, greed, and had ended in a bizarre, unique, and heartbreakingly tragic crime scene. The final confrontation took place in a sterile, windowless interview room at the SBI headquarters. Donovan Hail, who had been held without bail since the search of his home, sat across from Detective Zoe Shaw. His demeanor had changed. The confident, charming architect was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful man, his face a mask of cold, controlled anger. Shaw did not begin with accusations. She began with the evidence, laying it out on the metal table between them, piece by irrefutable piece. She started with a photograph of the microscopic blue insulation fibers. "These were found at the grave, Donovan," she said, her voice a calm, even monotone. "And they were found on the floor of your greenhouse, a perfect match." She laid down the next exhibit, the forensic accountant's report, detailing the embezzlement, the failing business, the secret investments. Then came the copy of the multi-million-dollar Keyman insurance policy, with his name as the sole controller in the event of Gabriel's death. Finally, she laid down a single, perfect pressed orchid, a photo of the gold of Kinabalu. "You are one of maybe a dozen people in the entire country who can cultivate this flower," she said, "and you surrounded a murdered child with them." Donovan stared at the evidence, a perfect, scientific, and logical reconstruction of his crime. He remained silent, his jaw tight. "It was never about the boy, was it?" Shaw continued, her voice pressing, relentless. "It was always about Gabriel, the insurance money. Kian just got in the way. He saw something he shouldn't have. He saw you getting ready to kill his father." It was that last sentence that finally broke him. The mention of his betrayal of his best friend, the man who had trusted him completely, seemed to pierce through his cold, narcissistic armor. A single, shuddering sob escaped his lips, and then the whole, ugly story came pouring out. He confessed to everything: the financial ruin, the insurance plot, the plan to murder Gabriel on the camping trip. He described the moment of pure, panicked horror when he had turned and seen Kian standing there, watching him, his small face a mask of confusion. He admitted to killing the boy to silence him, and to the twisted, ritualistic burial. A gesture he couldn't even explain himself. The confession sealed his fate. Donovan Hail was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The final scene of the story belongs to Gabriel and Naomi Sterling. They are standing in the small, circular clearing in the heart of the Pisgah National Forest. The crime scene tape is gone. The orchids have been removed. It is just a quiet, peaceful place in the woods again. They have come here to reclaim it, to replace the horror with a memory of their own. They have brought with them a small, simple granite stone. On it is an engraving of a map, a compass rose, and the words, "Kian Sterling, our expedition leader. Forever exploring." They place the stone in the center of the circle where their son's body was found. They stand there for a long time, in the quiet, dappled sunlight, their hands clasped together. The grief is a vast, permanent ocean. But for the first time in 5 years, it is not a grief poisoned by the not knowing or by the false comfort of a convenient lie. It is a clean grief. It is the truth. And in the deep, quiet heart of the forest, they are finally able to say goodbye.